It is 2 in the morning. You are in a castle. Not the castle of the tourist brochure. Not the romantically lit, professionally restored, gift shop adjacent castle that you visit on a Saturday afternoon and photograph for social media with a specific caption that combines medieval vibes with an inexplicable number of castle emoji. The actual castle, the working medieval castle of the 13th or 14th century, with its stone walls that are approximately a meter thick and that have been absorbing the January cold for the past several weeks with the specific patient thoroughness of stone that has been doing this for centuries and has no intention of stopping. The temperature outside is -8 degrees Celsius. The wind is coming from the northeast. Inside the castle in the Great Hall, where approximately 40 people are sleeping, the household knights, the senior servants, the various individuals who occupy the specific social middle ground of the castle's hierarchy. The temperature is approximately 4 degrees Celsius near the fire that has burned down to coals, and approximately 2 degrees Celsius near the wall, where the unfortunate junior members of the household have ended up. You are trying to sleep. You are failing. Not because the medieval person was physiologically incapable of sleep. Clearly they slept, or the species would have died out, which is a fairly definitive argument. They slept in conditions that the modern person, arriving from their centrally heated home with its memory foam mattress and its temperature-controlled duvet, would find genuinely comprehensively challenging. And they did this not as an exceptional ordeal, but as the ordinary, recurring, annual experience of the cold months, managed through the specific combination of practical knowledge, social arrangement, material technology, and what we might generously call adaptive optimism. This script is about how they managed it, how the medieval castle's sleeping arrangements worked, from the magnificent bed of the Lord to the rushes on the great hall floor, how the castle's architecture both created and attempted to solve the cold problem, how the specific technologies of the medieval sleeping world, the bed curtains, the warming pan, the straw mattress, the communal sleeping, were the genuine engineering responses to the genuine engineering problem of keeping a human body warm enough to sleep through a northern European January night in a stone building. And because this is also the story of the social world that the sleeping arrangements expressed, how the specific geography of who slept where in the medieval castle was as revealing about the medieval social order as anything the castle's more official spaces can tell you. Let's start with the building itself, because the building is the problem, and the building is the solution simultaneously. And understanding that paradox is the beginning of understanding how medieval castle sleeping actually worked. Chapter 1. The stone. Why the castle's primary building material was both the enemy and the ally. The stone is cold. This is the foundational fact of castle living, and it is a fact that the modern visitor to the preserved medieval castle experiences in the specific way of walking from the heated gift shop into the restored Great Hall and feeling the temperature drop in a way that the architectural context makes immediately comprehensible. The stone is cold because stone is cold, not in the sense of the surface texture alone, but in the sense of the thermal properties that make stone a poor insulator and a good conductor of heat away from whatever is in contact with it. The specific physics of the stone castle's thermal situation are worth understanding because they explain why the medieval occupants of the castle faced a different and more complex challenge than the simple observation "it was cold" suggests. Stone has a high thermal mass. It stores a large quantity of heat and releases it slowly. And this high thermal mass cuts in two directions depending on the specific circumstances. In the summer, The stone castle's high thermal mass was a genuine advantage. The thick stone walls absorbed the heat of the summer days and released it slowly through the summer nights, keeping the interior of the castle significantly cooler than the exterior temperature during the hottest part of the day. The summer castle was comfortable, genuinely, significantly cooler than the exterior environment. And the thermal mass of the stone that made the winter difficult was the same thermal mass that made the summer pleasant. In the winter, the thermal mass was the problem. The stone walls had been absorbing the cold of the autumn and early winter months, the specific process of the walls cooling slowly as the exterior temperature dropped, the heat stored in the stone radiating outward toward the cold, exterior rather than inward toward the warm interior. By January, the walls of the castle were cold all the way through. The thermal mass that had stored summer heat was now storing winter cold, and the reversal of this situation required not just the fire that the great hall had burning, but the sustained heat of multiple fires over multiple days to begin the process of warming the stone from the inside. The thickness of the walls that was the castle's primary defensive attribute. The walls of a substantial medieval castle were typically between 1 and 3 meters thick, depending on the castle's scale and period. Was also the thickness that the cold had to penetrate before the interior felt the warming effect of a brief period of good fires. The thin wall warms quickly and cools quickly. The thick wall takes days to warm and days to cool, and in the specific climate of the northern European winter, with the cold reliably sustained through the months of January and February, the thick wall was in a state of sustained cold that the castle's fires were fighting a losing battle to overcome. This is not to say that the fires were useless. They were not, and the management of the fires in the medieval castle was one of the most important aspects of the castle's thermal management system. But the fires were fighting not just the cold air of the interior, but the cold mass of the stone walls that surrounded the interior. And the specific combination of these two thermal challenges was what made the castle's winter heating situation genuinely difficult. The window was the castle's other primary thermal vulnerability, and the medieval castle's approach to windows reflected the specific conflict between the defensive requirement for limited openings and the thermal requirement for limited openings that happened to produce the same architectural result for completely different reasons. The narrow arrow loops of the earlier medieval castle, the vertical slits in the wall through which the archer could shoot outward while remaining protected, were not wide enough to significantly compromise the wall's thermal integrity. But the castle's windows that admitted light into the interior spaces were thermal problems of a different scale. Glass was available in the medieval period. Window glass was produced in Europe from the early medieval period, but it was expensive, fragile, and not universally installed in the castle's windows until the later medieval period. The unglazed window of the earlier medieval castle was covered with wooden shutters, the specific technology of the wooden shutter that excluded the wind and the rain while admitting the air when opened, and with oiled cloth or oiled linen that provided a translucent covering that admitted some light while reducing the direct wind. The oiled cloth was not a perfect thermal barrier. It was permeable to the cold air in ways that the glass window was not. But it was the available technology, and the management of the shutters and the cloth coverings through the winter was one of the daily thermal management operations of the castle household. The thickness of the stone wall created one specific practical advantage that the castle inhabitants exploited for thermal management: the window embrasure. The depth of the wall through which the window opening passed the specific deep splay of the window opening in a wall that might be 2 meters thick, created the enclosed, partially sheltered space of the window seat that is one of the more romantically imagined features of the medieval castle interior. The window seat in the castle wall was not primarily a romantic sitting for private conversations, though it served that purpose. It was a thermal refuge, the specific enclosed space created by the window opening's depth that was protected on 3 sides by the stone of the wall and on the 4th side by whatever window covering the specific embrasure used. In this enclosed space, the body heat of the person sitting in it accumulated in ways that the open great hall could not achieve, and the window seat was the specific microenvironment of the deep-walled castle, where a degree of warmth could be achieved that was unavailable in the open interior. The specific thermal advantage of the window embrasure was the advantage of the enclosed microenvironment, the same principle that the curtain bed would exploit in the sleeping context, and that the medieval thermal management system deployed in multiple forms throughout the castle spaces. The enclosure of the person in a smaller space allowed the body's heat to build up rather than dissipating into the larger volume of the unheated room. And the thermal management of the medieval castle was partly the management of spaces within spaces, the smaller enclosed environments where the body heat was retained rather than lost. The castle's orientation was another thermal management consideration that the medieval builder addressed with the specific knowledge of the local climate and the specific requirements of the building's function. The Great Hall, the primary living and sleeping space of the castle's household, was typically oriented to take advantage of the southern exposure that the northern European climate made valuable. The longer hours of sun on the southern face of the building providing the specific passive solar heating that the medieval builder understood through the empirical observation of which orientations made buildings warmer in winter. The placement of the Great Hall's fireplace, typically at one or both ends of the hall, or in the earlier period in the center of the hall, with the smoke rising to the roof, was the specific architectural decision that most directly affected the hall's heating, and the medieval builder's choices about the fireplace's location reflected the accumulated knowledge of what worked in the specific combination of the hall's dimensions, the fireplace's capacity, and the specific wind patterns of the site that affected the chimney's draw. The chimney itself was a relatively late development in the medieval castle's architectural history. The early medieval Great Hall used the central hearth with the smoke hole in the roof above it, and the wall-mounted fireplace with its chimney was the later development that represented a significant improvement in the hall's thermal performance. The chimney's specific advantage over the central hearth was the direction of the smoke, upward and out through the chimney flue, rather than rising through the occupied space and seeping through the smoke hole. And the specific thermal consequence was a hall that could be heated more effectively because the fire could be larger and the ventilation could be controlled more precisely. Chapter 2. The Great Hall, where most people in the castle actually slept, and what that looked like. You are sleeping on the floor, not on a bed, or not on what the modern person would recognize as a bed. You are in the Great Hall of the castle, on the rushes that cover the stone floor, wrapped in whatever you have brought with you to wrap yourself in, with the fire at the end of the hall, providing the heat that is keeping the temperature of the floor near you, marginally above the stone's natural temperature and significantly below the temperature that the modern person would find adequate for sleep. This is the reality of sleeping in the medieval castle for the majority of its occupants. The Great Hall was the dormitory for most of the castle's residents. The household knights who had not yet accumulated sufficient status or income to warrant private chambers, the senior servants whose rank entitled them to sleep in the hall, rather than in the less desirable spaces below stairs, the various attendants and retainers and visitors, who occupied the specific middle ground of the castle's social hierarchy. The great hall's sleeping function was not separate from its daytime function. The same space that served as the dining room, the reception room, and the administrative center of the castle's daily life was the sleeping space at night. The transformation achieved by the movement of the furniture and the laying of the sleeping bodies along the rush-covered floor. The trestle tables that served as dining tables during the day were the pieces of furniture most easily set aside, lifted from their supports and stacked against the wall, to create the sleeping space that the night required. The social geography of the sleeping arrangement in the great hall was the social geography of the castle itself, expressed in the specific spatial currency of proximity to the fire. The fire was the warmth. The warmth was the comfort. The comfort was allocated according to the social hierarchy with the specific, unself-conscious directness of a world that had not yet developed the cultural convention of pretending that comfort was distributed on any basis other than status. The senior members of the household, the knights and the senior officials whose rank entitled them to the best positions, slept closest to the fire, not because a formal rule required this, but because the informal social dynamics of the sleeping arrangement allocated the best positions to the highest status individuals in the specific, organic way of a hierarchical community organizing its shared space. The person who attempted to claim a position above their station would be moved, not necessarily by explicit instruction, but by the specific social pressure of the community that knew exactly where everyone stood. The junior members of the household, the pages and the young squires, and the servants who had not yet accumulated the rank that entitled them to better, slept at the far end of the hall from the fire in the specific cold that the fire's heat could not reach at that distance, wrapped in whatever the meager resources of their position permitted. The cold at the far end of the hall was the cold of the stone floor and the stone walls, without the moderating influence of the fire, and the specific experience of sleeping in that cold was a specific experience of the low-status member of the medieval castle's household. The rushes on the floor were the primary insulation between the sleeping bodies and the cold stone. The dried rushes, sometimes supplemented with fragrant herbs whose aromatic properties were both pleasant and potentially insect-deterring, provided a layer of organic material between the body and the stone that reduced the direct conduction of the cold from the floor into the sleeper. The rush layer was not perfect insulation. It was permeable to the cold in ways that a modern sleeping mat would not be, but it was meaningfully better than sleeping. Directly on the stone, and the thickness and freshness of the rushes was a genuine quality indicator of the hall's maintenance. The management of the rushes was the specific domestic responsibility of the household. The regular removal of the old compressed dirty rushes and the replacement with fresh ones was the housekeeping operation that maintained the hall's sleeping surface at a quality level that the household management literature of the period prescribed as necessary. The old rushes were not merely aesthetically unpleasant, they were thermally inferior to the fresh rushes, the compression reducing their loft, and therefore their insulating capacity, and the moisture they had absorbed further reducing their thermal performance. The bedding that the individuals brought to the hall varied with their status and their resources. The knight who had accumulated a career's worth of military income might have a decent wool blanket or a fur-lined coverlet. The specific items of personal bedding that the traveling household member carried with them as part of their personal equipment The page who had just entered the household might have a single wool blanket of moderate quality that their family had provided when they entered service. The cloak was the sleeping garment that the traveler and the household member who lacked dedicated sleeping equipment used as their primary bedding. The heavy woolen cloak that served a double duty as an outer garment during the day and as the primary sleeping covering at night. The medieval cloak was designed with this dual function in mind: the specific weight and the specific dimensions that made it effective as an outer garment in the wind, and rain also made it effective as a sleeping covering. And the experienced traveler who had learned to manage with minimal equipment valued the cloak's dual function as the specific efficiency of the limited luggage solution. The communal sleeping of the Great Hall was not merely the incidental consequence of limited private accommodation. It was a genuine thermal strategy. The multiple bodies sleeping in the same enclosed space, the Great Hall with its 40 or 50 sleeping members of the household, were contributing their collective body heat to the air of the space, and the collective body heat of 40 or 50 people was a genuine and significant thermal contribution to the hall's overnight temperature. The specific physics of the communal sleeping situation were the physics of multiple heat sources in an enclosed space. Each sleeping human body produces approximately 80 watts of metabolic heat, the heat generated by the body's resting metabolism that maintains the core temperature. 40 sleeping bodies produce 3,200 watts of heat, approximately equivalent to 3 modern electric fan heaters running simultaneously. In the specific enclosed volume of the Great Hall, this collective body heat was a genuinely significant contribution to the overnight temperature maintenance, and the medieval household that slept communally in the Great Hall was, perhaps without fully articulating it, exploiting this thermal benefit of collective sleeping. The fire's management through the night was the other significant factor in the Great Hall's thermal maintenance. The banked fire, the specific technique of covering the active fire with ash to reduce its oxygen supply and cause it to smolder at a lower temperature rather than burning actively, was the standard overnight fire management technique that allowed the fire to continue producing heat through the sleeping hours without consuming the fuel at the rate that the active fire required. The specific skill of banking the fire for the night was the skill of the experienced fire manager. The servant whose specific responsibility was the fire's overnight maintenance. Too little ash cover, and the fire burned through the ash and consumed itself before morning. Too much ash, and the fire was smothered and died, requiring the specific effort of relighting that the cold morning made less comfortable. The right quantity of ash, applied in the right distribution, produced the slow-burning, heat-producing coal bed that could sustain the hall's warmth through the night. The morning revival of the banked fire was the specific task that began the castle's day. The removal of the ash cover to expose the still glowing coals, the addition of the kindling and the fuel that the glowing coals could catch, the specific sequence of the fire management that the experienced firekeeper performed with the practice efficiency of the person who has done this every morning for years. The fire that was successfully banked through the night and successfully revived in the morning was the fire that maintained the hall's thermal continuity through the sleeping hours and into the working day. Chapter 3. The bed, the most expensive piece of furniture in the medieval castle, and why it was worth every penny. The Lord's bed was an engineering achievement, not in the way that the modern person uses the word engineering, not the precision engineering of the manufactured product, not the systematic application of the technical knowledge to the production of the designed artifact, but in the specific practical sense of the people who had a problem. staying warm enough to sleep comfortably in a stone castle in January, and who had, over the course of several generations, developed the specific solution that addressed the problem with the materials and the knowledge available to them. The high-status medieval bed was a piece of furniture of extraordinary complexity by the standards of the period's material culture, and the specific complexity of the bed was the complexity of the specific thermal engineering problem it was designed to solve. The person who slept in the Lord's bed was sleeping in a different thermal environment from the person sleeping on the hall floor. Not just a degree or two warmer, but in a genuinely different thermal situation. The kind of difference that allowed the Lord to sleep with something approaching the comfort that the modern heated bedroom provides. Let's build the bed from the bottom, because the thermal engineering of the medieval bed was built in layers, and the understanding of each layer is necessary for understanding the whole system's performance. The bed frame was the first component, the wooden structure that elevated the sleeping surface off the floor. The elevation was not merely aesthetic or symbolic, though it was also those things. The elevation was a thermal strategy. The cold of the stone floor radiated upward through the air, and the elevation of the sleeping surface above the floor created a thermal separation between the sleeper and the floor's cold that reduced the conducted heat loss that the floor contact would otherwise impose. The higher the bed frame, the greater this thermal separation, and the great beds of the medieval nobility, which in some cases were high enough to require a step to mount, were in part high for this specific thermal reason. The rope base, or the wooden slat base of the bed frame, was the specific structural support for the mattress, and its maintenance was a genuine aspect of the bed's performance. The rope base, the specific arrangement of ropes stretched between the rails of the frame in a grid pattern, needed to be tightened periodically as the rope's tension relaxed with use, and the failure to maintain the rope tension allowed the mattress to sag in the middle in ways that affected both the comfort and the thermal performance of the sleeping arrangement. The mattress was the second layer, and the hierarchy of the medieval mattress materials was a direct expression of the social hierarchy of the castle's occupants. At the top of the hierarchy was the feather mattress, the mattress stuffed with the down of waterfowl, typically geese or swans, whose specific thermal properties were genuinely excellent. Down is one of the most effective natural insulating materials known. The specific structure of the down cluster, with its branching fibers that trap a large volume of air relative to the down's own weight, creates the low-density, high-insulation material that the modern outdoor equipment industry still uses for its best sleeping bags and jackets. The feather mattress of the medieval period was genuinely warm. The down beneath the sleeping body compressed under the body's weight, but still provided significant thermal insulation from the cold air below, and the uncompressed down at the sides and above the body created the specific enveloping warmth of the down-filled sleeping environment that the modern person who has slept under a down duvet recognizes as one of the genuine thermal pleasures available to the human body. Below, the feather mattress in the hierarchy was the wool mattress, the mattress stuffed with processed wool or wool batting, which provided genuine insulation through the specific air-trapping properties of the wool fiber. The wool mattress was warmer than the straw mattress, but significantly less warm than the feather mattress, and the distinction between the feather mattress sleeper and the wool mattress sleeper was a genuinely thermal distinction as well as a social one. At the bottom of the mattress hierarchy was the straw mattress, the sack of coarse fabric stuffed with straw or hay that was the sleeping surface of the lower status members of the castle household, and the standard sleeping surface of the majority of the medieval population who didn't have access to the wool or feather alternatives. The straw mattress was better than nothing. The straw provided some insulation through the trapped air in its structure, and the thickness of a generous straw mattress was meaningfully warmer than sleeping directly on the rush-covered floor, but it compressed under the body's weight in ways that reduced its insulating loft, and the compressed straw offered significantly less thermal protection than the uncompressed version. The sheets were the third layer, the linen sheets that the well-furnished medieval bed included, the smooth textile that separated the sleeper's skin from the rougher texture of the mattress above, and the wool blankets below. Linen was the specific textile of choice for the sheets of the medieval bed because of its specific thermal properties. Linen is cooler than wool against the skin, which sounds counterproductive, but is actually the appropriate property for the layer that is closest to the body. The moisture-wicking property of linen, its capacity to absorb the body's perspiration and allow it to evaporate, keeping the skin drier than the wool that absorbed moisture less effectively, was the specific textile characteristic that made linen the appropriate base layer material for the sleeping system. The blankets were the fourth layer, the multiple wool blankets that the well-furnished medieval bed included, the specific layering of wool over the sleeping body that was the primary insulation of the medieval sleeping system. The wool blankets were typically placed above the sleeper, over rather than under, and their specific insulating function was the trapping of the warm air that the sleeping body generated in the space between the blanket and the body, preventing that warm air from escaping into the colder air of the room above. The number of blankets was the specific variable that could be adjusted to the specific thermal requirements of the particular night. More blankets in the coldest weather. Fewer when the temperature was less extreme. The well-furnished medieval bedroom's supply of blankets was therefore a genuine comfort resource, the specific stockpile of the insulating material that the variable winter temperature required. The fur coverlet was the fifth layer, the luxury outer covering that the wealthiest medieval households included in the bed's equipment. The fur was typically the pelt of a large animal, placed with the fur facing down toward the sleeper and the leather facing up, was the specific thermal luxury that the well-connected medieval noble could afford, and that added the specific additional insulating capacity that the fur's dense fiber structure provided. The fur's thermal mechanism was the same mechanism as the modern pile or fleece. The dense directional fibers trapped a thick layer of still air against the sleeper, providing insulation of the highest quality that the medieval material culture could produce. The curtains were the sixth and most important layer, and the curtains were the specific feature of the high-status medieval bed that distinguished it most dramatically from the sleeping arrangement. Of the lower-status occupants of the castle, the four-poster bed with its curtains was the specific thermal engineering achievement that allowed the medieval noble to sleep in a genuinely warm environment despite the cold of the castle room. The curtains of the four-poster bed, the heavy textile hangings that enclosed the sleeping space on all four sides and sometimes above, created the specific micro-environment of the curtain bed, the small enclosed space within the larger cold room where the sleeper's body heat accumulated rather than dissipating into the larger volume of the unheated chamber. The physics of the curtain bed were the same physics as the great hall's communal sleeping, the multiple bodies generating heat in an enclosed space, but applied to the single sleeping person in the specific, more efficient form of the smaller enclosed volume. The single sleeper in the curtain bed was generating the same 80 watts of metabolic heat as the single sleeper on the hall floor, but that heat was accumulating in the enclosed volume of the curtain bed rather than dissipating into the larger volume of the hall. The result was a genuinely different thermal environment. The interior of the curtain bed could reach a temperature significantly above the ambient temperature of the room, providing the sleeping lord with a warmth that the hall sleeper could not achieve. The specific material of the bed curtains was heavy wool or heavy silk, the dense, tightly woven textile that would minimize the air permeability that would allow the accumulated warmth to leak out. The silk curtains of the wealthiest medieval households were not merely luxury. The silk's specific weave density made it a genuinely effective thermal barrier, the expensive material earning its thermal performance as well as its aesthetic appeal. Chapter 4. The Solar, the Private Chamber, and How It Changed Everything About Castle. Sleeping. The solar was the revolution, not the French Revolution. That's several centuries in the wrong direction. The specific revolution in medieval castle. Sleeping, that the development of the private chamber, the solar, the wardrobe, the great chamber, represented the architectural evolution that gradually transformed the medieval castle from the single communal sleeping space of the great hall to the specific private rooms that the lord and the increasingly differentiated senior members of the household occupied as the medieval period progressed. The solar, the private room at the upper end of the castle, typically on the upper floor, and often with southern exposure to take advantage of the sun's warmth, from which its name derived, was the medieval castle's specific private sleeping space for the lord and the lady. The first significant architectural separation of the high-status sleepers from the communal arrangement of the Great Hall. The solar's thermal advantages over the Great Hall were multiple and significant. The smaller volume of the solar meant that the heat generated by the fireplace, and the solar invariably had a fireplace, the specific wall-mounted hearth with chimney that the later medieval period had developed, had less air to heat than the Great Hall's enormous volume. The fireplace that would barely affect the temperature of the Great Hall could meaningfully warm the solar's smaller space to a temperature that was, by medieval standards, genuinely comfortable. The solar's fireplace was the wall fireplace with the chimney. The specific architectural development that the medieval castle adopted in the 12th and 13th centuries, and that significantly improved the heating of the private chambers relative to the central hearth of the earlier Great Hall. The chimney's specific advantage was the direction of the smoke, upward and out through the flue, rather than rising through the occupied space. And the specific thermal consequence was the ability to maintain a larger, hotter fire in the private chamber without the smoke inhalation that had limited the effective size of the central hearth's fire. The fireplace of the solar was also the social statement that the fireplace's possession in a private room represented the specific luxury of the private fire, the warmth that did not have to be shared with the 40 other bodies of the Great Hall, the heat that was generated specifically for the comfort of the lord and the lady in their specific private space. The private fire was a genuine thermal luxury, as well as a social statement, and the medieval castle's progressive provision of fireplaces in its private chambers was the progressive improvement of the thermal comfort available to the high-status occupants. The tapestries were the solar's specific thermal management technology, and their role in the thermal performance of the private chamber was as important as their decorative function. The tapestry, the heavy woven textile hung against the stone wall, created the specific thermal barrier between the cold stone and the room's interior that the stone's thermal mass would otherwise deny. The tapestry did not eliminate the cold of the stone. It could not change the stone's temperature, but it prevented the direct contact between the room's air and the cold stone surface, reducing the convective heat loss that the cold stone surface created by chilling the air immediately adjacent to it. The air gap between the tapestry and the stone wall was the specific thermal mechanism that made the tapestry effective as an insulating layer. The still air trapped between the tapestry and the wall provided thermal resistance, the specific insulating property of the still air that made double-glazed windows effective in the modern period, and that the tapestry was exploiting through the same physical mechanism. The still air in the gap did not conduct heat as readily as the stone or even the tapestry itself, providing the insulating layer that separated the warm interior from the cold stone. The rushes and the carpets on the floor of the solar performed the same function for the floor that the tapestries performed for the walls. The specific separation of the occupied surface from the cold stone below. The creation of the insulating layer that reduced the conducted heat loss from the people walking and sitting and sleeping in the room to the cold stone floor beneath. The carpets of the more prosperous medieval chambers, the woven floor coverings that were among the most expensive domestic textiles of the period, were the luxury version of the rush insulation that provided both the aesthetic warmth of the textile and the genuine thermal insulation of the air-trapping woven material. The shuttered windows of the solar were managed with the specific attention to their thermal impact that the solar's more refined thermal environment required. The shutters, closed at night, reduced the heat loss through the window opening. The specific thermal management operation of closing the shutters as the evening temperature dropped and the glass or oiled cloth covering was insufficient to prevent the cold from penetrating. The solar's window shutters were often more elaborate than the great hall's, hinged wooden panels with the specific fitting that reduced the gap around the edges through which the cold air could infiltrate. The bed in the solar was the elaborate, multi-layered curtain bed that the previous chapter described, and its thermal performance in the specific context of the solar was better than its thermal performance in the Great Hall would have been, because the starting temperature of the room was higher, and the accumulated warmth of the smaller space meant that the curtain bed's interior temperature could reach genuinely comfortable levels. The warming pan was the specific technology of the private chambers. Bedtime preparation, the device that bridged the gap between the cold bed and the warm sleeper's body. The warming pan was a metal pan with a long handle. The pan filled with hot coals from the fireplace, the perforated lid containing the coals, while allowing the heat to radiate. That was moved through the bed before the sleeper entered, warming the sheets and the mattress covers to the temperature that made the cold initial contact of the body with the bed considerably more pleasant. The warming pan's specific operation was the operation of the servant who prepared the Lord's bed for sleeping, the specific domestic service of warming the bed that was as much a part of the evening's household routine as the banking of the fire. The servant who moved the warming pan through the bed, sliding it between the sheets along the length of the sleeping surface, was performing a genuine thermal service, and the bed that had been properly warmed received the sleeping Lord with the specific comfort of the pre-warmed surface rather than the shock of the cold linen. The hot stone was the warming pan of the less wealthy. The flat stone heated in or near the fireplace, wrapped in cloth to prevent direct contact with the fabric, placed at the foot of the bed before retiring. The thermal mass of the stone, the same thermal mass that made the castle walls cold, worked in the stone's favor when the stone was the warm object. The heated stone released its stored heat slowly through the night, maintaining warmth at the foot of the bed for hours after the fire had been banked. Chapter 5. The clothing. What medieval people actually wore to bed, and why it mattered more than the blankets. The nightgown was not optional. Not in the sense of the modern person's choice between the pajamas and the boxers, and the nothing at all that the temperature-controlled bedroom makes equally available. In the sense that the medieval sleeping garment was a genuine thermal technology whose specific design reflected the specific thermal challenges of the medieval sleeping environment, and whose absence would have significantly reduced the sleeper's ability to maintain the core temperature that the body required for the sleep, that the body required for the morning's work. The medieval sleeping garment, the chemise for women, the shirt, or the specific nightgown for men, was made of linen in its standard form. And the choice of linen rather than wool for the garment closest to the skin was the specific, empirically derived decision of a culture that had learned through experience what the modern textile science confirms. Linen's specific moisture management properties made it the superior choice for the skin contact layer of the sleeping arrangement. The linen chemise, or shirt, was the base layer of the medieval sleeping system, the specific textile that managed the interface between the body and the heavier wool coverings above. The linen's capacity to absorb the moisture that the sleeping body produced, the perspiration that even the winter sleeper generates through the night, and to allow that moisture to evaporate rather than accumulating against the skin was the specific property that prevented the specific discomfort of the damp, cold clothing against the skin that the wool garment against the skin would eventually produce. The length of the sleeping garment was the specific thermal design decision that reflected the medieval understanding of where the body lost heat most critically. The chemise and the nightgown were typically full length, reaching to the ankle or below, covering the legs and the feet that the blankets might not reliably cover through the night's movements. The sleeping person who moved in the night could shift the blankets to an arrangement that exposed the legs or the feet to the cold air, and the full-length sleeping garment was the specific insurance against this exposure that the blanket arrangement could not reliably provide. The nightcap was the specific accessory of the medieval sleeping ensemble that the modern person tends to find amusing, and the medieval person found genuinely necessary. The head loses a disproportionate amount of the body's heat. The specific physiology of the head's blood supply, with its dense network of surface vessels, makes the uninsulated head a significant heat loss pathway in the cold environment. The sleeping cap, the fitted linen or wool cap that covered the head and ears, was the specific thermal management technology for this heat loss pathway, and the medieval person who slept without it was the medieval person who was losing a meaningful fraction of their body's overnight heat production through the top of their head. The nightcap's specific design, fitted closely to the head, sometimes with ties under the chin that kept it in place through the night's movements, was the design of the practical thermal technology rather than the fashion accessory. The person who tied the nightcap strings under their chin was the person who had learned through experience that the cap that was not secured would be found on the pillow rather than on the head by the middle of the night, having achieved nothing useful. The ties were the specific engineering solution to the specific problem of the sleeping garment that the night's movement removed from its intended position. The socks, or more accurately, the hose of the medieval period, were another element of the sleeping ensemble that the medieval person of the cooler climates retained for sleeping. The feet are the extremity most vulnerable to the cold in the sleeping situation, the furthest from the body's core, the most likely to be exposed by the night's movements, the specific part of the body whose cold the sleeper feels most immediately and most uncomfortably in the first moments of the cold sleep. The medieval person who went to bed with their hose on was the person applying the specific thermal management of the insulated extremity that the sleeping situation required. The gown worn during the day, the heavy woolen outer garment of the medieval person's daily dress, was sometimes retained for sleeping in the coldest periods, not in the specific form of the nightgown that the period recognized as the dedicated sleeping garment, but in the pragmatic form of the person who had determined that the available blankets were insufficient for the ambient cold, and who had added whatever additional insulation was available. The practical medieval person who slept in their day clothes on the coldest nights was not failing to maintain the social distinctions between the day and the night. They were making the specific, rational decision that warmth was more immediately important than the distinction. The hair was the thermal management consideration for the women of the medieval castle, whose long hair was the specific heat loss pathway that the nightcap eddressed for the head, and that the hair itself partly managed for the neck and the shoulders. The practice of braiding or otherwise containing the long hair for sleep was not only the practical management of the tangles that loose hair would produce through the night's movements, it was also the specific thermal management of the hair as an insulating layer for the neck and upper body. The specific positioning of the hair to maximize its insulating contribution to the sleeping warmth. The fur-lined garment was the luxury version of the sleeping ensemble, available to the wealthiest inhabitants of the medieval castle. The nightgown or the sleeping robe, whose inner surface was lined with the fur that provided the highest quality insulation available to the medieval material culture. The fur lining of the sleeping garment was the same thermal technology as the fur coverlet applied to the garment form. The dense, air-trapping fiber structure of the fur in direct contact with or close to the skin, providing the specific warmth of the fur's insulating properties in the garment that the sleeping person could not displace through the night's movements in the way that the coverlet could be displaced. Chapter 6. The fire, the castle's primary heating technology, and the people whose job it was to manage it. Someone had to wake up at 3 a.m. to tend the fire. This was not a metaphorical responsibility. It was the specific, practical, occupationally assigned task of the specific members of the castle household, whose job description included the fire's overnight maintenance, whose sleep was structurally interrupted by the requirement to wake and assess and manage the fire at the specific intervals that the fire's overnight behavior required. The fire was the castle's primary heating technology, and its management was as specialized and as consequential as any other management responsibility in the castle's operation. The fire that was properly managed through the night was the fire that the hall woke up to with the residual warmth that the banked coals provided, that could be revived in the morning to produce the heat that the day's operations required. The fire that was poorly managed, that was banked too heavily and died, or that burned through the ash and consumed itself before morning, was the fire that left the hall cold in the morning and required the full process of relighting from scratch. The specific person responsible for the fire's overnight management was typically the lowest ranking servant who could be trusted with the task. The specific allocation of the disrupted sleep to the person whose social position made the sacrifice of their sleep comfort the most economically rational from the castle administration's perspective. The page, the junior groom, the young servant who had not yet accumulated the rank or the length, feat of service that entitled them to the undisturbed sleep of the senior household member. These were the specific individuals whose night included the specific responsibility of the fire's maintenance. The fire watching duty was not continuous. The specific servant was not expected to remain awake and observant throughout the entire night. The duty was the periodic check, the specific waking at the interval that the fire's expected behavior required, the assessment of the fire's state, the specific intervention of the ash addition or the fuel addition that the assessment indicated, and the return to sleep for the next interval. The experienced firekeeper knew the specific signs of the fire's state, the glow of the coals through the ash, the specific smell of the well-banked fire, the temperature of the air near the fireplace, that allowed the periodic check to be conducted efficiently. The castle's multiple fires were the multiple responsibilities. The Great Hall, fire, the kitchen fire, the Solar's fire, and the various other fires in the castle's specific heated spaces were each requiring their own overnight management by the specific servants assigned to each. The kitchen fire was the most continuously maintained of the castle's fires. The kitchen fire that never went out, that was banked at night and revived in the morning, but was maintained through the year with the specific continuity that the cooking operations required. The fuel supply was the specific practical constraint on the castle's fire management. The wood pile, whose size determined the winter's heating capacity, the specific organization of the fuel supply that the castle's management had to anticipate and prepare for, through the summer and autumn collection and storage of the wood that the winter's fires would consume. The castle that ran out of fuel in February was the castle that faced the specific emergency of the inadequate heating in the coldest months, and the management of the fuel supply was among the most important logistical responsibilities of the castle's administration. The wood's specific properties mattered for the fire's management. The well-seasoned wood that had been cut and dried for at least a year before burning, burned with the specific clean efficiency of the low moisture fuel, producing more heat per unit weight and less smoke than the green wood, whose high moisture content was consumed in the drying process before the combustion could begin efficiently. The castle's woodpile was ideally the woodpile of the properly seasoned fuel, cut well in advance and stored dry, and the castle's management that failed to maintain this standard was the castle management that heated less efficiently with more smoke for the same consumption of fuel. The peat was the specific fuel of the castle in the regions where the wood was less available. The boggy regions of Ireland and Scotland and the northern English uplands, where the peat deposits provided the alternative fuel that the wood-scarce landscape did not. Peat burned differently from wood, slower, longer, at a lower temperature, with the specific characteristic smell that the peat fire produces, and that the memory of anyone who has experienced it associates permanently with the specific atmospheric quality of the cold, damp, high-latitude environment where the peat fire is the native heating technology. The coal was the fuel that the medieval period was beginning to exploit in the specific regions where the coal deposits were accessible. The northeast of England, where the surface coal seams of the Durham and Northumberland coal fields provided the specific fuel that the medieval castle's proximity to the deposits made economically available. The coal fire was hotter and longer burning than the wood fire, and its specific thermal performance was the thermal performance that made it the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. The specific intense heat that the coal's higher carbon content produced was a genuine advantage in the heating application. The charcoal was the processed fuel whose specific advantages over raw wood. The higher energy density, the lower smoke production, the specific controllable burn characteristics made it the preferred fuel for the specific heating applications where its higher cost was justified by its superior performance. The brazier, the portable metal container of burning charcoal, was the specific heating technology of the private chamber, whose small size and the desire for a more controlled and less smoky heat source than the wood fire provided made the charcoal fuel attractive despite its higher cost. The brazier was the portable fire, the specific movable heating device that could be placed in the specific location within the room where its heat was most needed, moved as the requirements of the occupants changed, and managed with the specific simplicity of the container of burning charcoal that required less skill and less maintenance than the full fireplace fire. The brazier was also the specific danger. The charcoal burning in the enclosed space of the private chamber produced the carbon monoxide that the combustion of carbon-based fuel in insufficient oxygen generates, and the specific deaths from charcoal fume, asphyxiation in the enclosed spaces of the medieval period were documented with the specific regularity of the hazard that was known and not adequately managed. Chapter 7. The Children. How Medieval Castle. Children slept, and the specific arrangements that kept them alive through the winter. The infant did not sleep alone. The specific absolute imperative of the medieval infant's sleeping arrangement was the imperative of the survival, the recognition embedded in the practical experience of the medieval parents' management of the infant's survival through the winter, that the infant body's specific thermal vulnerability required the specific thermal management of the adult body's proximity that provided the warmth the infant could not generate sufficiently for its own survival. The infant's specific thermal vulnerability was the vulnerability of the small body with the large surface area relative to its volume. The specific geometry of the small body that made it lose heat faster than the larger body in the same ambient temperature. The physics were straightforward. The heat loss from a body is proportional to its surface area, and the heat generation is proportional to its volume, and the ratio of surface area to volume is larger for the small body than for the large body. The infant in the cold room was the infant losing heat faster than its metabolism could generate it, and the specific consequence of this physics was the hypothermia that was a genuine, significant cause of infant mortality in the medieval winter. The co-sleeping of the infant with the parents, or the nurse, was the specific thermal solution to this vulnerability, the adult body's heat generation, supplementing the infant's insufficient generation, the specific warmth of the adult body providing the thermal environment that the infant's own metabolism could not maintain. The medieval parent who slept with the infant was the medieval parent making the specific rational decision that the infant's survival through the cold night required the adult's thermal contribution. The co-sleeping carried its own specific danger. The overlying, the specific accident of the sleeping adult rolling onto or pressing against the infant in a way that suffocated the child. The medieval records, the church court records and the coroner's inquests, and the ecclesiastical penalties documented the overlying deaths with the regularity of the genuine hazard, and the church's specific instruction against co-sleeping with the infant was the institutional response to this documented danger. The specific tension between the co-sleeping's thermal benefit and the overlying's mortal risk was the tension that the medieval parent negotiated with the specific practical tools available to them. The wooden cradle placed in the parental bed, the small cradle that sat within the bed's frame or beside it, close enough to the parent's warmth to benefit from the body heat without the direct contact that the overlying required, was the specific engineering solution that attempted to capture the thermal benefit of proximity without the physical contact of the dangerous co-sleeping. The warming of the cradle before the infant was placed in it was the specific domestic operation of the medieval infant's bedtime routine. The same warming pan technology applied to the smaller space of the cradle. The specific preparation of the sleeping surface that the cold cradle's initial temperature would otherwise make distressing for the infant. The nurse who warmed the cradle before the infant was placed was performing the specific thermal service of the experienced infant manager who understood that the cold initial contact was the specific stimulus that caused the infant's distress and disrupted the specific sleep that the infant and the household required. The swaddling of the infant was the specific sleeping preparation that the medieval period practiced with the specific comprehensive wrapping of the infant's body in the linen bands that constrained the limbs and covered the body from the neck to the feet, providing the specific thermal management of the insulating layer that the swaddled cloth provided, and the specific restraint that prevented the infant's night movements from disturbing the sleeping arrangement or displacing the covering. The swaddling's thermal function was the function of the body wrap, the enclosing of the body in the textile layer that reduced the exposed surface area and therefore the rate of heat loss. The swaddled infant was the thermal equivalent of the sealed sleeping bag, the body enclosed in the textile that prevented the cold air from reaching the skin directly, maintaining the warmer microenvironment within the wrap against the colder air outside it. The older child, past the infant stage but still too young to manage their own sleeping arrangements, was typically part of the communal sleeping arrangement of the household's junior members, sleeping in the great hall with the pages and the junior servants, wrapped in whatever the household's supply of spare bedding permitted. The specific experience of the 10-year-old page sleeping at the cold end of the great hall was the specific experience of the castle childhood, not the romantic adventure of the historical novel, but the specific, cold, interrupted sleep of the child in the institutional sleeping arrangement. The Lord's own children occupied a specific, intermediate position in the castle's sleeping hierarchy. Above the hall, floor, below the solar, in the specific arrangement of the nursery that the castle's private accommodation provided for the children of the family. The nursery was the private space that the Lord's children shared with the nurse. The specific professional caregiver, whose role included the overnight management of the children's sleep, and the specific fire tending and blanket adjusting that the children's overnight thermal management required. Chapter 8. The Food and Drink. How the evening meal and the night cup contributed to the castle's sleeping strategy. The supper was thermal management, not the primary thermal management. The fire and the bed and the blankets were the primary thermal management, but the specific contribution to the overnight thermal balance that the evening meal made through the specific physiological mechanism of the dietary thermogenesis that the digestion of the food produced. The body's metabolism increases in the hours after eating as the digestive process generates heat, the specific heat of the metabolic reactions of the digestion. And the person who had eaten a substantial evening meal was the person who fell asleep with the specific elevated metabolic rate of the active digestion, providing additional heat production through the first hours of the night. The medieval understanding of the supper's thermal contribution was not the biochemical understanding of the modern physiology. The medieval person did not know about metabolic rate or dietary thermogenesis in the specific quantitative terms of the modern nutritional science, but the empirical observation of what happened after eating, the specific warmth, the drowsiness, the specific bodily comfort of the well-fed person preparing for sleep, was the empirical knowledge that the medieval domestic management translated into the practical recommendation of the adequate evening meal as part of the winter sleeping preparation. The specific Composition of the evening meal in the medieval castle reflected the period's understanding of which foods were most conducive to the warm sleep. The hot food was preferred over the cold, not only for the immediate warmth of the consumption, but for the specific prolonged heat generation of the active digestion that the substantial hot meal produced. The pottage, the thick grain and legume soup that was the staple of the medieval diet across social levels, was the specific sleeping preparation food of the efficient thermal management, providing the slow digesting carbohydrate and protein that sustained the metabolic activity through the sleeping hours. The meat of the evening meal was the specific high protein component whose digestion produced the elevated heat generation of the protein metabolism. The thermic effect of food that is highest for protein, significant for carbohydrate, and lowest for fat. A hierarchy that the medieval dietary tradition was empirically observing in the specific recommendation of the substantial meat course for the evening meal. The castle's great hall supper was not solely thermal management. It was also the social occasion of the day's formal eating, the specific gathering of the household that the evening meal represented. But the thermal contribution of the substantial supper to the night's sleeping comfort was real and recognized. The ale and the wine of the evening were the thermal management contributions that the medieval household valued and that the modern physiologist would partially dispute. The specific warmth of the consumed alcohol, the vasodilation that the alcohol produced, the feeling of warmth that the peripheral blood flow increase created, was experienced by the medieval drinker as the specific, genuine warming effect of the drink. The paradox of the alcohol's actual thermal management effect, the vasodilation that moved warm blood to the surface of the body and increased the rate of heat loss to the environment, producing the feeling of warmth while actually reducing the core temperature's maintenance, was not available to the medieval understanding. The spiced drink of the evening was the specific, elaborate version of the thermal management beverage that the wealthier medieval household produced. The hypocras, the warm, wine-based drink, spiced with the ginger and the cinnamon, and the other aromatics that the medieval pharmaceutical tradition identified as warming in their specific humoral properties. The spiced drink was the beverage of the thermal preparation for sleep in the medieval castle's more comfortable levels, providing the specific combination of the alcohol's perceived warmth, the actual warmth of the hot liquid, and the specific pharmacological effects of the ginger and the cinnamon that the humoral tradition attributed to them. The nightcap, the specific small cup of drink taken immediately before retiring, was the specific ritual of the medieval bedtime that combined the thermal management function with the social function of the final marking of the day's end. The nightcap was not named for the sleeping hat. The naming coincidence that the two uses of the word produce is the coincidence of two separate developments in the same period. But for the specific final drink of the night that the medieval household took before the household dispersed to its sleeping arrangements. The warming of the bed drinks in winter was the specific preparation that the servant undertook before the household retired. The mulling of the wine or the warming of the ale in the pot over the fire. The specific addition of the spices that the warmed drink required. The preparation of the nightcap that the household member would consume before the specific transition from the warmth of the great hall's fire to the colder air of the sleeping space. The transition from the heated social space to the colder sleeping space was the specific thermal challenge of the bedtime moment, and the warm drink was the specific preparation of the body for the thermal shock of the transition. The bread and the cheese of the lightest evening eating were the specific nighttime foods of the lower status members of the household. The page and the junior servant who did not participate in the full supper of the Lord's household, but who had the specific, modest evening eating that the kitchen produced for the junior members' consumption. The bread and cheese provided the specific, slow-digesting nutrition that would sustain the metabolic activity through the sleeping hours, even if the specific thermal contribution of the more modest meal was less than the substantial supper's contribution. Chapter 9. The smell, the specific, comprehensive olfactory reality of the medieval castle. At night, and how people managed it. The smell was not optional. The modern visitor to the preserved medieval castle experiences the smell of the stone and the dust, and the specific institutional smell of the heritage preservation. The medieval inhabitant of the functioning castle experienced the smell of the stone and the dust and everything else. The specific, comprehensive, layered, frankly overwhelming, olfactory reality of a building occupied by a substantial number of people, animals, and organic materials without the plumbing, the waste management, and the chemical cleaning products of the modern sanitation system. The rushes on the great hall floor were the primary smell management technology of the medieval castle's main living space. And their smell management function was the function that the management literature of the period specifically acknowledged. The fresh rushes, cut from the riverside meadows and dried before laying, had the specific pleasant smell of the dried grass, the same smell that the modern person associates with the hay bale and the thatch, and the scattering of the fragrant herbs through the rush layer added the specific aromatic notes that the period's domestic management recommended. The specific herbs recommended for scattering through the rushes were the herbs of the medieval aromatic tradition: lavender, rosemary, meadowsweet, sweet flag, whose aromatic properties were both pleasant in themselves and potentially insect deterring in the specific, empirically derived way of the practice that worked sufficiently well to be recommended across multiple centuries of domestic management advice. The insect deterrence was the specific practical function that the rush herb served alongside the aromatic one. The fleas and the lice and the various other small inhabitants of the medieval floor rush that the fragrant herbs were observed to reduce, though the mechanism was not understood in the specific terms of the modern entomology. The old rushes were the specific olfactory problem of the poorly managed castle household. The rushes that had been in place too long, that had absorbed the various organic contributions of the great hall's traffic over the weeks of their use, that had become the specific, organic, decomposing layer that the domestic management advice warned against allowing to accumulate. The well-managed castle hall had its rushes changed regularly. The poorly managed hall had the specific, identifiable smell of the old rushes that the period's literature occasionally remarked upon as the specific marker of the negligent housekeeping. The animals shared the castle's spaces in the specific, integrated way of the medieval domestic management that had not yet developed the modern convention of the strict separation between the human living space and the animal space. The dogs, the hunting hounds, and the guard dogs and the various other dogs that the medieval castle maintained as working animals were typically present in the great hall, sleeping near the fire alongside the human occupants and contributing their specific olfactory presence to the hall's nighttime atmosphere. The hawks and the falcons of the castle's hunting establishment were kept in the specific space of the mews, the designated falconry building, rather than in the great hall, but their specific sharp smell was part of the castle's olfactory landscape in the specific areas of the mews and the adjacent spaces where the bird management happened. The falconer who worked with the birds daily carried their specific smell into whatever space the falconer occupied. The chamber pot was the specific nighttime sanitation technology whose olfactory consequences were the olfactory consequences of the unventilated medieval room that the chamber pot served through the night. The alternative to the chamber pot, the journey from the sleeping space to the garderobe, the castle's latrine, through the cold corridors of the winter castle at 2 in the morning, was the alternative that the chamber pot's olfactory disadvantage was weighed against. And for most of the castle's occupants, through most of the winter nights, the chamber pot won the comparison. The garderobe was the medieval castle's latrine. The specific architectural provision of the castle's sanitation, typically built into the thickness of the outer wall, with the specific shaft that discharged either into the moat below or onto the exterior slope of the castle's foundations. The garderobe's specific olfactory environment was not unrelated to its name. The medieval French word for the wardrobe, whose clothing storage function was combined with the latrine in the specific space-efficient arrangement that hung the clothing in the latrine space, on the specific theory that the ammonia vapors of the latrine discouraged the moths. The beeswax candles and the tallow candles that provided the castle's artificial light were the specific olfactory contributors of the evening and early nighttime. The beeswax candles of the wealthy with their specific, pleasant, honey-derived smell. The tallow candles of the less wealthy with their specific, animal fat-derived smell that the modern nose finds considerably less pleasant. The extinguishing of the candles at bedtime. The specific household routine of the candle management that conserved the expensive fuel while reducing the fire risk produced the specific, sudden release of the extinguished candle's smoke and the residual smell of the burned wick. The smoky hall was a specific olfactory consequence of the fire management in the spaces without adequate chimney provision. The early medieval Great Hall with its central hearth and smoke hole, or the hall where the chimney's draw was inadequate for the wind conditions, allowed the smoke to infiltrate the occupied space in ways that the modern person would find immediately intolerable. And the medieval occupant managed through the specific pragmatic adjustment of the person who could not change the condition and had therefore adapted to it. The specific smell of the medieval castle at night, the rushes and the herbs and the dogs and the candle smoke and the fire smoke and the garderobe and the chamber pot and the bodies of the 40 sleeping people, and the specific combined olfactory reality of all of these things in the enclosed stone space of the January night was the specific sensory reality of the medieval sleeping experience that the romantic version of the medieval castle politely omits. The medieval occupants of the castle did not omit it. They managed it with the specific practical tools of the domestic management that the period had developed. The fresh rushes, the aromatic herbs, the ventilation management of the shutters, the specific placement of the garderobe in its external wall position. And they lived with a specific residual smell that the management could reduce but not eliminate, in the specific pragmatic way of the person who has adapted to the conditions of their environment and for whom those conditions are the baseline normal rather than the remarkable exception. Chapter 10. The water, the specific problem of plumbing washing and the medieval castle's relationship with liquid in winter. The water in the jug has frozen, not metaphorically, literally. The specific jug of water that the servant placed in the Lord's chamber last night, the jug that was meant to provide the morning washing water that the daily routine of the castle required, has a specific skin of ice across its surface that is approximately a centimeter thick and that will require the specific intervention of the heated fire poker or the placement near the revived fire before it becomes water again, rather than the specific inconvenient solid that the night's temperature has produced. This is the winter water problem of the medieval castle, and it is a problem that the modern person, accustomed to the specific, reliable delivery of hot water from the heated pipe at the turn of the tap, struggles to fully appreciate, because the modern person has never had to think about whether the water would be water or ice when they needed it. The medieval castle occupant thought about this regularly because the answer was genuinely variable, and the consequences of the answer genuinely affected the specific operations of the morning that the water was required for. The castle's water supply came from the well, the specific structural provision of the well within the castle's walls, that was both the practical water supply for the household's daily needs and the strategic necessity of the castle under siege, whose defenders could not survive without access to water. The well was typically positioned in the castle's inner ward, the specific, protected central space of the castle, and its depth was the depth that the local geology required to reach the water table, which varied from site to site and which the castle's builder had determined through the specific empirical process of digging until water appeared. The well water in winter was cold, colder than the modern tap water, whose passage through the pipes of the heated building slightly warmed it before delivery. The well water was the temperature of the ground at depth, which, in the northern European winter, was the temperature of the ground that had been cooling since the autumn, and which was several degrees below the comfortable washing temperature. The servant who drew water from the well for the castle's morning washing was the servant who was providing the specific cold raw material that the heating of the fire would have to address before the water was useful for the specific physical comfort of the washing. The heating of the water was the morning task that preceded the delivery of the washing water to the castle's private chambers, the specific operation of the kitchen fire that produced the hot water in the large pots, whose content the servants then distributed to the various points in the castle where the hot water was required. The distance from the kitchen to the Lord's solar, the physical distance that the servant carrying the hot water jug traversed through the cold corridors of the morning castle, was the distance over which the hot water cooled in the jug, and the specific skill of the experienced servant was the timing that ensured the water arrived warm, rather than merely tepid after its journey through the unheated passageways. The specific quantity of washing that the medieval castle's daily routine required was not the quantity that the modern person's bathroom routine involves. The medieval washing was the functional washing, the hands and the face, the specific parts of the body that the daily work brought into contact with the surfaces and substances that required cleaning before the activities of the day could proceed. The full-body bathing of the modern shower was a different activity, occurring at different intervals, requiring different provisions, and possessing a different place in the castle's daily routine from the daily hand-washing and face-washing of the morning. The bath in the medieval castle was a genuine production, not the quick, private, mechanically assisted experience of the modern bathroom, but the specific, labor-intensive, socially elaborate event that the heating and carrying of sufficient water to fill the tub required. The wooden tub, the barrel-like container that the medieval castle's bathing required, needed several buckets of hot water to fill to a useful depth, and each bucket of hot water represented the specific chain of labor, from the well drawing to the fire, heating to the carrying that the medieval household's servants performed as part of the bathing preparation. The bathing tub was placed near the fire, the specific positioning of the bathing equipment in the location where the fire's Heat maintained the water's temperature through the duration of the bath, and where the person emerging from the water stepped into the warm air rather than the cold air of the unheated room. The bath that was taken near the fire in the solar was the bath taken in the specific micro-environment of the heated private chamber, where the experience was as comfortable as the medieval castle could make it. The alternative, the bath taken in the unheated space away from the fire, was the experience whose discomfort the prepared bathing room's warmth was specifically designed to avoid. The hair washing was the specific operation whose specific labor requirements made it an occasional rather than a daily activity. The length of the medieval woman's hair, and to a lesser degree the medieval man's, meant that the washing of the hair required a substantial quantity of water and a substantial time for the drying that the cold air of the castle made both slow and uncomfortable. The specific domestic technology of the hair drying in the medieval castle was the technology of the fire's proximity. The person sitting near the fire with the damp hair arranged to catch the heat that would dry it before the cold of the castle air produced the specific unpleasant experience of the long-haired person who had washed their hair in January and then moved away from the fire into the corridors. The personal washing of the great hall sleepers was the personal washing of the people whose access to hot water was less reliable and less abundant than the lord's. The bowl of cold water from the courtyard trough, the specific basic washing facility of the lower status member of the castle household, was the washing water, whose temperature in January was the temperature that the specific brief application to the face and hands required the specific rapid efficiency of the person who was getting the necessary done without lingering over the experience. The management of the privies and the garderobe shafts in winter was the specific maintenance challenge of the castle administration, whose failure to address it produced the specific consequences that the accumulated waste in the frozen shaft represented. The garderobe shaft, the specific architectural provision of the latrine's discharge channel, was the channel that the winter's cold could freeze if the conditions were severe enough and the discharge insufficient to maintain the flow. The frozen garderobe shaft was a specific medieval infrastructure problem that the specific unpleasant maintenance operation was required to address. The moat in winter was the frozen moat, the specific defensive water barrier whose freezing in severe winters presented the castle with the specific strategic vulnerability of the moat that had become a walkable surface rather than the water barrier its design intended. The frozen moat was the tactical emergency of the medieval castle's winter defense and the specific winter management of the moat. The breaking of the ice to maintain its defensive function was the winter military engineering operation of the castle garrison. Chapter 11. The rank and the room. The specific social geography of who slept where and how. That geography changed over the medieval period. The castle's sleeping arrangements were a map. Not a map in the cartographic sense. Not the representation of the physical geography of the castle's spaces on a scaled drawing. A social map. The specific arrangement of the sleeping bodies through the castle's spaces that expressed with the precise, unambiguous clarity of the lived social world exactly where each person stood in the hierarchy that the castle's organization expressed. The person who knew the castle knew, from the specific location in which they slept, everything they needed to know about the relative position of every other person in the castle's social order. The Lord slept in the solar, not by convention in the soft sense of the mere custom, by convention in the hard sense of the social rule, whose violation was a genuine, consequential challenge to the social order that the castle's hierarchy maintained. The Lord's sleeping space was the physical expression of the Lord's social position at the top of the castle's hierarchy, and the specific physical security of the solar, its position within the castle, its distance from the less controlled public spaces of the Great Hall, was also the specific practical security of the Lord's person that the sleeping space's private character provided. The lady slept in the solar with the Lord, or in the specific arrangement of the great chamber that the castle's more elaborate accommodation provided. The specific adjacent space that the lady occupied with her own attendants, connected to the Lord's sleeping space by the specific architectural proximity that the medieval domestic arrangement maintained between the Lord and the lady, while providing the specific private space that the lady's attendance and the lady's daytime activities required. The lady's chamber was not simply the feminine version of the Lord's solar. It was the specific functional space of the woman who managed the castle's domestic operations, whose daytime use of the space as the center of the sewing and the reading and the receiving of visitors that the lady's role required made its nighttime use as the sleeping space the specific natural consequence of the space's primary identification with the lady's presence. The chamberlain, the specific senior household official, whose title literally referenced the chamber, the private room whose management was the chamberlain's primary responsibility, slept in the specific adjacent space that gave him physical access to the Lord's chamber throughout the night. The chamberlain's nighttime accessibility was the nighttime version of the chamberlain's daytime function. The management of the Lord's person and the Lord's private space that the chamberlain's role required was a 24-hour responsibility, and the specific sleeping proximity of the chamberlain to the Lord was the specific architectural expression of that responsibility. The knight's bachelor, the knights who had not yet established their own households and who were members of the Lord's household as his military retinue, slept in the great hall as the senior occupants of the communal sleeping space, the specific position at the fire's most advantageous end that their rank within the hall's hierarchy entitled them to. The knight who slept in the Lord's hall was the knight who was simultaneously dependent on the Lord's hospitality and constitutive of the Lord's social display. The gathering of the knights in the Lord's hall was the specific social expression of the Lord's power and the Lord's generosity that the medieval social world valued as a demonstration of lordly status. The progression from the hall floor to the private chamber was the career trajectory that the specific individual advancement in the medieval household followed. The specific social mobility of the person who moved from the junior position at the cold end of the hall to the senior position near the fire, and eventually to the specific private accommodation that the most senior positions in the household provided. The person who had advanced to the private chamber had advanced not merely in the social sense of the elevated position, but in the physical sense of the warmer, more comfortable, more private sleeping space that the elevated position provided. The visiting noble was a specific social challenge of the castle's sleeping arrangement. The person of superior or equivalent rank, whose visit required the provision of sleeping accommodation appropriate to their status, which, in the specific circumstances of the well-occupied castle, might require the lord to vacate the solar in favor of the guest and to find alternative sleeping accommodation for his own household. The politics of the sleeping arrangement, the specific negotiations about who received which chamber and who was displaced to the hall, and what the displacement said about the relative standing of the parties involved, were the politics of the hospitality culture whose specific material expression was the provision of sleeping spaces. The garrison soldiers, the men-at-arms who constituted the castle's permanent military establishment, and whose primary function was the castle's defense, slept in the specific spaces of the garrison accommodation that the castle's military design had provided. The guard room, the gatehouse, the tower rooms that the garrison occupied were the sleeping spaces of the permanent military presence, whose specific occupational requirement of readiness at any hour shaped the sleeping arrangement in the specific direction of the communal, rapidly interrupted, functionally organized sleep of the military unit. The sentries and the watch, the specific overnight military function of the castle, whose guards walked the walls and monitored the castle's external environment through the dark hours, were the specific castle occupants whose sleep was most systematically disrupted by their occupational function. The watch rotation, the specific military organization of the overnight security duty that divided the night's hours among the available soldiers, was the organization that maintained the castle's security while distributing the disruption of the overnight duty across the garrison's membership, rather than imposing it permanently on any individual. The garrison soldier on watch in January was the specific miserable figure of the medieval castle's winter military routine, the person walking the battlements in the specific cold wind of the northern European winter, wrapped in whatever the specific military equipment and the personal resources of the working soldier permitted, maintaining the alert that the watch required while managing the specific physiological challenge of the wakefulness in the cold that the overnight watch imposed. Chapter 12. The illness, how cold related. Sickness shaped the medieval castle's winter, and the specific medical responses available. Everyone in the castle had a cough. Not everyone, always. The specific statement requires the specific qualification that the medieval winter's respiratory realities deserve. But the castle's population in January contained a substantial number of people who were in some stage of the respiratory illness, that the specific combined conditions of the cold, the damp, the smoke, the close quarters, and the inadequate nutrition of the winter months reliably produced in the medieval Northern European population. The medieval understanding of why people got sick in winter was not the germ theory understanding of the modern medicine. The specific pathogenic organisms whose transmission was the mechanism of the infectious illness, whose identification required the microscopy that the medieval period did not have, whose understanding was not available until the late 19th century's bacteriological revolution. The medieval understanding was the humoral understanding, the specific ancient theoretical framework of the four humors whose balance or imbalance the medieval physician understood as the mechanism of the health and the illness, and whose winter-specific imbalance toward the cold and the damp produced the specific winter illnesses that the medieval clinical tradition observed. The phlegm, the specific humor of the cold and the damp, was the humor that the winter produced in excess in the medieval theoretical understanding, and the specific respiratory illnesses of the winter were the illnesses of the excessive phlegm, whose accumulation in the chest and the head produced the cough and the congestion and the specific miserable experience of the head cold that the winter reliably generated. The treatment of the winter respiratory illness in the humoral framework was the treatment of the excessive phlegm, the warming and the drying that would restore the balance, the specific therapeutic applications of heat, and the specific pharmaceutical applications of the warming herbs that the humoral tradition prescribed. The castle's physician, or the physician's equivalent in the specific variable provision of the medieval castle's medical services, managed the winter illnesses with the specific medical toolkit of the period. The warming posset, the hot, spiced drink of the milk and the ale, and the specific warming spices that the medieval pharmaceutical tradition employed, was the specific medical preparation whose warming properties addressed the humoral excess of the cold and the damp that the winter illness represented. The posset was both the medical treatment and the comfort beverage, the specific indistinct category of the medieval medicine that had not yet separated the pharmaceutical from the nutritional from the simply comforting. The poultice was the specific external application that the medieval treatment of the chest illness employed. The specific heated cloth of the medicated preparation applied to the chest or the throat of the sick person. The external warmth addressing the internal cold that the humoral theory identified as the illness's mechanism. The mustard poultice, the specific pungent preparation that the medieval and subsequent folk medicine tradition employed for the chest illness, was the thermal and the chemical irritant that produced the specific increased blood flow to the skin of the chest that the medieval practitioner observed, and that the modern physiologist understands as the circulatory response to the counter-irritant. The herbs of the castle garden and the castle supply of the purchased spices were the specific pharmaceutical resources of the medieval illness management. The feverfew and the elderflower and the honey and the ginger and the specific accumulated pharmacopoeia of the medieval tradition that addressed the winter illnesses with the specific combinations of the warming and the soothing that the available materials permitted. The honey, the specific natural product of the beehive that the medieval castle maintained in the castle's grounds, was the specific pharmaceutical staple of the winter illness management. Its specific antimicrobial properties, not understood in the modern sense, but its soothing, coating, sweetening function thoroughly understood in the empirical sense of the substance that made the sore throat less painful and the cough less relentless. The sick room was the specific medical space of the castle, whose provision reflected the castle's scale and the lord's investment in the welfare of the household. The castle that had a designated space for the sick, a room separate from the great hall, where the ill member of the household could be isolated from the communal sleeping and given the specific, attentive care of the individual management, was the castle whose specific investment in the welfare of its occupants produced the specific outcome of the better survival from the illnesses that the cold and the close quarters reliably generated. The isolation of the sick was not, in the medieval understanding, the infection control of the germ theory, the specific, deliberate prevention of the pathogen's transmission from the sick person to the well person. It was the management of the sick person's humoral environment, the creation of the specific, controlled space where the warming and the quiet and the dietary management that the illness required could be provided without the disruption of the communal hall's occupation. The Tiababa outcome was the same, the reduced transmission of the respiratory illness through the household, even if the mechanism was understood differently. The children's illness was the specific acute concern of the castle's winter management. The vulnerability of the child's immune system to the respiratory pathogens that the winter concentration of the household made readily available, and the specific higher mortality of the child's serious respiratory illness relative to the adults. The nurse whose responsibility included the overnight management of the Lord's children was the nurse whose winter responsibility included the specific nighttime management of the feverish child. The child whose fever required the specific paradoxical management of the medieval tradition, the warm covering to address the humoral cold, while the elevated temperature itself represented a genuine physiological emergency. The fever management of the medieval tradition was the management of the specific dangerous condition whose elevated temperature the medieval clinician recognized as the critical phase of the illness, and whose outcome was the outcome that the specific management was intended to influence. The cooling of the fever through the application of the cold cloth, the specific, symptomatic management of the elevated temperature that the medieval tradition employed alongside the warming treatments of the humoral approach, was the empirically derived observation that the fever's excess heat required the cooling application even within the framework of the humoral theory that generally recommended warming. Chapter 13. The Prayers, the specific religious dimension of the medieval castle's night, and how it shaped the sleeping routine. The night was not secular. The specific modern assumption of the night time as the private secular space of the individual's rest, the time that belongs to the person and not to the institutional or the religious, was not the assumption of the medieval castle's nighttime. The night of the medieval castle was the night of the canonical hours, the specific ecclesiastical division of the 24 hours into the liturgical offices that the church had developed from the monastic tradition and that the secular household was expected to observe in the specific adapted form that the lay life required. The canonical hours divided the night into the specific liturgical markers that shaped the castle's nighttime routine in ways that the modern person does not have a direct equivalent for. The Compline, the last of the day's liturgical offices, sung or recited at the end of the day before retiring, was the specific religious act of closing the day that the castle's household conducted before the sleeping arrangement was made. The Compline's prayers were the prayers of commendation, the specific religious act of placing the person's sleep under the divine protection, the acknowledgement that the night and its sleeping were in the hands of the providence that governed the waking hours as well. The chapel of the medieval castle was the specific architectural provision of the religious life that the castle's design incorporated as the standard element of the household's religious practice. The castle without a chapel was the castle whose lord had failed to provide the specific material expression of the household's religious obligation that the period expected. And the castle with the chapel was the castle whose morning mass and evening compline were the specific daily ritual anchors of the household's communal life. The chaplain's role in the castle's nighttime was the chaplain's role as the person whose specific ecclesiastical function included the provision of the compline that closed the day and the matins and lauds that opened it. The matins, the specific canonical office of the deep night, traditionally observed at approximately 3 a.m. Venda was the specific nighttime religious interruption that the devout lord might maintain as a personal practice, and that the castle's chapel attendance made possible. The prayer before sleeping was the specific individual religious practice of the medieval person, whose personal piety was expressed in the specific daily routine of the night prayer. The kneeling by the bed, the specific prayers of the person's devotional tradition, the particular saints whose intercession the slaver sought for the protection of the night. The night was a time of the specific spiritual vulnerabilities that the medieval tradition identified as the night's special dangers, the bad dreams, the spiritual temptations, the specific demonic attentions that the darkness was understood to enable. And the prayer before sleeping was the specific prophylactic, spiritual practice that addressed these vulnerabilities. The cold of the stone floor of the chapel or the bedchamber, the specific physical experience of kneeling in prayer on the January floor of the unheated space, was the specific ascetic dimension of the night prayer that the devout medieval person accepted as the physical expression of the spiritual seriousness that the prayer required. The kneeling on the cold stone was not accidental discomfort, It was the specific, deliberate physical element of the devotional practice that the medieval tradition understood as the appropriate posture for the serious prayer. The holy water stoup, the small vessel of blessed water placed at the entrance to the chamber, was the specific domestic religious provision that the medieval castle's private accommodation included as the standard feature of the devout household. The blessing with the holy water before retiring was the specific ritual act of the physical and spiritual purification that the medieval tradition prescribed for the transition from the waking day to the sleeping night. The candle before the saint's image was the specific devotional practice of the private chamber that the medieval household maintained as the personal expression of the relationship with the specific saints, whose particular intercessory roles the household members had cultivated. The candle left burning before the image of the patron saint through the night was the specific material expression of the ongoing prayer. The light that maintained the devotional presence through the sleeping hours, when the person's conscious prayer was suspended. The dream was not the neutral, psychological event of the modern understanding, not the specific, neurological byproduct of the sleeping brain's consolidation processes. The medieval dream was the potential divine communication, the specific medium through which the divine, or the diabolical, addressed the sleeping person, the specific prophetic or warning content that the dreaming mind received from the sources that the waking mind could not access directly. The interpretation of the dream was the specific skilled activity of the person whose learning in the tradition of the dream interpretation, the biblical tradition of the Joseph and the Daniel, the patristic tradition of the Augustine and the Gregory, equipped them to identify the divine communication within the dream's content. The nightmare was the specific terrifying form of the night's spiritual danger, the specific demonic attack that the medieval tradition understood as the physical and spiritual assault of the creature the English called the mare, and the nightmare named for. The specific physical symptoms of the nightmare, the paralysis, the chest pressure, the specific terror of the experience that the modern sleep science understands as the sleep paralysis event, were the symptoms that the medieval tradition understood as the specific physical manifestation of the demonic assault on the sleeping person. The specific protective charms and prayers against the nightmare were the specific practical responses of the medieval tradition to the specific terrifying experience of the sleep paralysis event and the associated nightmare experience. The charm against the mare, the specific verbal formula of the protective tradition, was the specific popular religious practice that the Church's official theology regarded with the ambivalence of the institution that had to manage the boundary between the acceptable devotional practice and the unacceptable folk magic within a tradition that included substantial elements of both. Chapter 14. The Seasons, how the sleeping arrangements of the medieval castle changed through the year and what summer. Sleeping looked like the summer was a different castle. The same stones, the same walls, the same architectural arrangement of the spaces that the winter had made into the specific problem and solution simultaneously. But a different thermal reality, a different olfactory reality, and a different social arrangement of the sleeping spaces, whose summer configuration reflected the summer's specific combination of the warmth, the longer days, and the particular seasonal challenges that the northern European summer produced alongside its relief from the winter cold. The castle in summer was the castle whose thick stone walls delivered their summer advantage, the specific thermal mass effect that kept the interior significantly cooler than the exterior during the hottest part of the summer day. The solar that had been the specific thermally privileged space of the winter, the heated private chamber with its fire and its curtained bed, became the less desirable space of the summer, when the thicker walls in the lower floor chambers were cooler, and the solar's southern exposure produced the specific warmth that its winter advantage had relied on. The summer sleeping arrangement inverted elements of the winter arrangement in the specific ways that the seasonal change in the thermal challenge required. The floor that had been the thermal enemy of the winter, the cold stone against which the rushes and the mattresses were the insulation, became the thermal ally of the summer, the cool surface whose contact with the sleeping body provided the specific relief from the summer heat that the modern person achieves through the air conditioning and the cold sheet. The summer sleeper who lay on the floor of the stone-floored room was the summer sleeper, benefiting from the same thermal mass that had made the winter floor the thing to be insulated against. The windows that had been managed with the specific thermal conservation of the winter, the shutters closed, the oiled cloth in place, the heat of the interior protected from the cold outside, were the windows of the summer that were managed with the opposite intention. The summer window management was the ventilation management, the specific opening of the windows and the shutters to admit the cooling air of the night that the stone's thermal mass had prevented from entering during the day. The summer night air flowing through the open windows of the great hall was the summer night cooling that the castle's thermal management was specifically attempting to capture. The insects were the specific summer sleeping challenge that replaced the cold as the primary adversary of the comfortable night's sleep. The mosquitoes and the flies and the various other flying insects of the northern European summer were the specific nighttime pests, whose management required the specific seasonal adaptation of the sleeping arrangement. The bed curtains that winter kept closed against the cold were the bed curtains that summer kept closed against the insects. The same physical structure serving the same enclosure function, but against a different adversary. The summer rushes were the rushes of the more frequent change, the warm, temperature accelerating the decomposition of the organic material and requiring the more frequent renewal that the summer's warmth made both more necessary and more practically inconvenient than the winter change. The summer rush management was the more demanding management precisely because the conditions that made the rushes comfortable also made them decompose faster and therefore require more frequent attention. The outdoor sleeping was the specific summer practice that the warmest nights permitted. The sleeping in the castle's courtyard or the garden, the specific relief of the open air sleeping on the summer night, whose warmth made the stone building's interior unnecessary for the thermal protection it provided in winter. The courtyard sleeping was the sleeping of the practical response to the specific summer conditions that made the stone building's interior the less comfortable option. The accumulated heat of the day's sun on the stone walls radiating back into the interior through the evening hours, while the open courtyard offered the specific cooling air movement that the interior could not provide. The Great Hall's summer transformation was the transformation of the space, whose winter function as the communal dormitory was less necessary in the summer months, when the warmth permitted the sleeping in less protected spaces, and when the specific social dynamics of the summer, the longer days, the reduced pressure of the indoor gathering around the fire, the increased outdoor activity, distributed the household's time more broadly through the castle's spaces and the adjacent grounds than the winter's concentration around the heat sources had permitted. The harvest season was the specific annual period of maximum stress on the castle's sleeping arrangements, the time when the castle population swelled with the additional agricultural labor of the harvest, and the various other seasonal workers whose presence required the specific, expanded sleeping provision that the castle's ordinary spaces could not always comfortably accommodate. The harvest barn, the stable, the various outbuildings of the castle's agricultural infrastructure became the sleeping spaces of the seasonal expansion. The specific, improvised dormitories of the harvest period, whose occupants managed the specific practical challenges of the agricultural laborers sleeping in the outbuilding, with the same pragmatic adaptation that characterized the medieval person's approach to the sleeping challenges that the calendar reliably produced. Conclusion: the full picture. What the medieval castle's sleeping arrangements reveal about the people who lived through them come back to the castle. It is still 2 a.m. The fire in the great hall has been banged by the junior servant who woke at the appropriate interval to check it, and who has now gone back to sleep at the cold end of the hall with the specific practiced efficiency of the person who has performed this operation enough times that the waking and the checking and the banking and the returning to sleep happens without the full engagement of the waking consciousness that the unfamiliar task requires. The fire is producing the slow, steady warmth of the well-banked coal bed. The 40 people sleeping in the hall are producing the collective warmth of their combined metabolic heat. The temperature near the fire is 4 degrees. The temperature at the far end is 2. In the solar above the hall, the lord and the lady are in the curtained bed. The heavy silk hangings closed around the specific micro-environment that their combined body heat and the residual warmth of the evening fire have produced inside the curtained space. The temperature inside the curtained bed is warm enough to sleep comfortably. The temperature outside the curtains in the solar is cold enough that the Lord's breath would be visible if he were standing in it. The specific thermal engineering of the curtained bed is performing exactly as designed. The chaplain is awake. He has risen for the matins, the 3 a.m. office that his specific ecclesiastical vocation requires him to observe, and he is in the castle chapel performing the specific liturgical duty of the nighttime office, in the specific cold space of the unheated chapel where the candle flames bend in the draught from the poorly fitting door, and where his breath is visible in the candlelight as the specific physical evidence of the January cold that the chapel's stone walls have stored since October. The sentry on the eastern wall is cold. He has been cold for 2 hours, and he will be cold for another 2 hours until the watch rotation replaces him with the next soldier, and he can descend from the wall to the guardroom, and the specific relative warmth of the space where the guardroom fire is banked, and where the resumed sleep will be interrupted again in 4 hours by the next rotation. This is his winter. It is every winter. He has adapted to it in the specific way of the person who has had no choice about adapting. What do all of these specific individual sleeping situations tell us about the medieval castle and the people who lived in it? They tell us something genuinely important about the specific relationship between the material conditions and the social organization. The specific way that the medieval castle's sleeping arrangements were not merely the consequence of the social hierarchy, but one of its primary expressions. The hierarchy was real and warm and cold at the same time. Warm for those at the top, cold for those at the bottom, with the specific physical experience of the temperature difference between the solar and the far end of the hall being the physical embodiment of the social difference between the lord and the page. This is not a metaphor. It is the specific material reality of the medieval social order expressed in the thermal currency that everyone understood without requiring explanation. The person who woke in the cold end of the Great Hall understood their position in the social order as a physical experience every January morning. The person who woke in the warmed solar understood theirs the same way. The social order was not merely the abstract hierarchy of the feudal theory. It was the specific physical temperature at which you woke up. They tell us something important about the specific human ingenuity that the material limitation produces. The medieval castle was a genuinely challenging environment for the maintenance of the human comfort that the body requires, and the specific accumulated knowledge of the medieval period about how to manage that challenge. The curtained bed, the banked fire, the tapestry on the wall, the warming pan in the bed, the layered clothing of the sleeping garment and the nightcap and the hose, was the specific practical engineering of the people who had a problem and had developed solutions through the specific empirical process of the generations of experience that identified what worked. The solutions were not perfect. They were better than nothing, and some of them were considerably better than nothing. But none of them achieved the specific comprehensive comfort of the modern centrally heated bedroom with its controlled temperature and its insulated walls and its double glazing and its memory foam mattress. The medieval person, sleeping in the best circumstances the castle could provide, was sleeping in conditions that the modern person would find challenging. The medieval person, sleeping in the worst circumstances the castle contained, was sleeping in conditions that the modern person would find genuinely difficult to manage. But they managed, not by some superhuman tolerance of the cold that the medieval constitution possessed, and the modern one lacks. The medieval body was the same body as the modern body, with the same thermal requirements and the same physiological responses to the cold. They managed by the specific, accumulated practical knowledge of the thermal management that the generation of experience had produced, by the specific, social arrangement of the communal sleeping that exploited the collective body heat, by the specific material technologies of the bed and the blanket and the curtain and the fire, and by the specific adaptive psychology of the person for whom the cold was the baseline normal rather than the exceptional condition. They tell us something important about what the word comfort means and how the specific material conditions of the person's environment shape the meaning that the word carries. The Lord sleeping in the curtained bed was comfortable, genuinely, meaningfully comfortable by the standards of what was available in the medieval world and by his own specific experiential standard of what comfort meant. The page sleeping at the cold end of the hall was uncomfortable, genuinely, meaningfully uncomfortable by the same standards, and no amount of philosophical accommodation changes the specific physical experience of the cold that the poor sleeping position produced. The gap between the Lord's comfort and the page's discomfort was the gap that the social order maintained as one of its primary material expressions, and the history of the subsequent centuries is in large part the history of the gradual, uneven, incomplete, but real and ongoing reduction of that gap. The specific historical process through which the material conditions that had concentrated comfort at the top of the social hierarchy were progressively unevenly distributed further down through the social structure. The central heating is the conclusion of a very long argument about who deserves to be warm. The medieval castle is where the argument started, in the specific physical arrangement of the 40 sleeping bodies around the banked fire, the warmest positions allocated to the highest ranks, the coldest positions left for whoever remained. They tell us something about endurance, not the romantic endurance of the historical mythology, the noble suffering of the brave medieval spirit that the modern person is supposed to find inspiring, the practical endurance of the specific ordinary human being who woke up cold every January morning for their entire life, and who got up anyway because the cattle needed feeding, and the bread needed baking, And the Lord's hall needed the fire revived, and the world that the winter interrupted had to be resumed. The junior servant who woke at 3 in the morning to check the fire did not think of themselves as the heroic embodiment of the medieval spirit. They thought about the fire. They checked it. They added the ash or the fuel that the fire's state required. They went back to sleep in the cold at the far end of the hall. In the morning, they got up and did the same things. They did every morning. This is the history that the specific material reality of the medieval castle's sleeping arrangements preserves. The history of the ordinary person doing the ordinary work of the survival, night after night, in the specific, cold, smoky, smelly, socially stratified, practically ingenious, humanly recognizable world of the working medieval castle. The fire is banked, the hall is cold, the curtain bed is warm. Someone has to wake up at 3 in the morning. They always did.